Hi, I'm Angus Kress Gillespie, your host for Old Ways in New Jersey here on East Brunswick Television. I'm here today with Elijah Reiss, who is a lifelong East Brunswick resident. Elijah recently graduated with honors from Rutgers University. He wrote his senior thesis on the Voorhees Mall at the heart of Rutgers University's New Brunswick campus. It is a celebrated location among students and faculty alike. Century-old American elm trees line concrete walkways alongside fields of grass. Monumental buildings enclose the mall, promoting a collegiate atmosphere. The mall has been the site of spring Frisbee games, student demonstrations, as well as graduation ceremonies throughout the last century. This mall did not appear overnight, and its construction was no accident. Elijah has made a careful study of how it all came about, and he has become something of an expert on the topic. So it's my pleasure to welcome Elijah Reiss to our studio today. Elijah, I know that when I'm walking through the old Queens campus, specifically the Voorhees Mall, I have the sense that, wow, this really looks like an Ivy League campus.
Yeah.
And I think that's on purpose. But before we get into the nitty-gritty about the Voorhees Mall, tell us a little bit about the background of the City Beautiful movement.
Okay, so the City Beautiful movement came about in the late 1800s, sort of as the Second Industrial Revolution was dying down. People were looking at cities, U.S. residents and planners alike, and saying, these are just really ugly. There's just a lot of mess here. I'm sure you're familiar with images of the tenements at the end of the century in cities like New York and Boston and Chicago. Automobile traffic was starting to come in the very early stages. And it was just sort of, they had been built way too quickly.
Messy.
Yeah, they were messy.
Like even the St. Louis, Missouri waterfront was very messy.
It was very messy. It was very disorganized. So architects sort of got together, and one in particular, Daniel Burnham, he said, you know, why don't we look at what the French had done through, I'm not sure if you're familiar, haussmanization and sort of making of wide avenues and public parks, and subsequently, in a lot of cases, destroying the slums. He looked at that in particular for the 1893 World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, which celebrated the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World, 1 year late, because it was in 1893. And he went about and built this thing called the White City. It was these temporary structures clad in sort of a faux marble facade, because these were only temporary buildings, as it was a World's Fair. It was meant to be temporary. And he took an area of Chicago and essentially transformed it into sort of like a big palace, everything gleaming in white, buildings made for the display of art, machinery, the latest advances in technology, sort of what these World's Fairs, which don't really exist anymore, used to display. And he sort of is known as the father of the City Beautiful movement. And it's sort of in its name. It's, let's take something that's very disorganized, not very commuter-friendly, not very people-friendly, and turn it into something that reflects sort of an urban nature, but sort of a transformative atmosphere, creating these cities which were completely artificial. You know, they had to displace a lot of people, usually low-income immigrants, the sort of the bottom of the food chain, and let's make something beautiful. And that's where it's known as the White City came about. And eventually, other cities started adopting this.
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C., of course. We know the National Mall, and there was this plan at the turn of the century, around 1900, called the McMillan Plan. And Daniel Burnham from Chicago was an advisor to the McMillan Plan. It was, I think, formerly known as the Senate Commission on the Parks. It has some long name. And they took a look at the Victorian National Mall and said, let's transform this for the 20th century. Something with City Beautiful was it really disliked Victorian architecture. It disliked sort of this bougie, sort of overly ornamented, asymmetrical, castle-like planning. They thought it was, you know, too fussy, yeah, and it didn't really benefit its citizens. So what Burnham did in the McMillan Plan was he said, let's take the Washington Monument, which at that point was an endpoint on the National Mall, and he said, let's make it a midpoint. And they extended it towards the Potomac River, going that direction, and they built the Lincoln Memorial as an endpoint, gleaming in this white marble. They got rid of these curving expanses, made them very straight, very linear.
It was monumental.
It was monumental, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it also wanted to prevent, particularly in the McMillan Plan, they wanted to prevent the railroads, power plants. They wanted to prevent that, sort of a not in my backyard sort of thing.
Yeah.
Although these things were necessary, City Beautiful said, yes to progress, but let's make it look good.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about Chicago, we've talked about Washington, D.C., but this had spillover effect with colleges and universities.
Yes.
Let's start with Columbia, for example.
Okay, so at the end of the 19th century, Columbia had outgrown its previous location, which it had been at since the 1850s, because they were originally in Lower Manhattan. And when they outgrew this location, because enrollments were rising, they said, okay, we need to build a new campus. So they found a location uptown, the current location of the university, and they had a competition to see who could, you know, come up with a plan for this new campus that would accommodate modern needs of the era in terms of sciences, but also modern facilities for study. There just wasn't enough room. Charles Follen McKim of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with McKim, Mead & White, the firm.
Sure.
They built the original Penn Station, which was demolished in the 60s. He came in and built the plan for Columbia's new campus at the end of the 19th century. And again, it followed this sort of rational principles of design, wide avenues, a quadrangle, everything very square with buildings flanking these walkways. And at the center, he had a centerpiece built, which was the Low Library, named after President Low of the time. And this was really the centerpiece of the campus.
Still is.
It still is.
Yeah.
Huge monumental building in white marble with your classical elements of design, columns surrounded by a huge rotunda dome in sort of a Greek cross plan, and I'll be getting this later. That was this Greek cross plan was borrowed eventually by Rutgers when they built their first purpose-built library about a decade later. So it definitely influenced. It started in the cities, and then, you know, a campus like Columbia, that's right in the middle of the city, it spilled over into college campuses, as we're going to see.
I even recall that at one point the U.S. Post Office issued a commemorative stamp with a picture of the Low Library.
Yeah, it was President Low. He wasn't really an academic. He was more of a civic businessman, and he actually was about to run for mayor of New York City, which I don't believe he won. And so he wanted his name to be attached to this library. He wanted the Low Library to have his name on it, to not only be, and this is a big tenet of City Beautiful planning, not only benefit the students, but also benefit the city as a whole, because residents from the city all throughout could use this library for study. They even had a program to take out books. It was not only for the elite at the Ivy League.
Yeah. And so segueing from Columbia, let's talk about the University of Minnesota.
Yeah, so at the University of Minnesota, Cass Gilbert, another City Beautiful planner, designed a plan right on the river with, again, it's a complete transformative effort on this campus, getting rid of these curving areas, sort of dirty urban areas, and replacing them with these buildings. And although it wasn't followed 100% like McKim's plan was at Columbia, it was largely followed, probably about 60 to 80% through by 1908, and it's still reflected in their campus today. You see a lot of these grid patterns, because that wasn't really something that was thought of until really the latter half of the 19th century as a way to accommodate large people that would be coming in and out of these universities and these cities. So it really had a lot of spillover and influence in these years.
And now, jumping ahead to Rutgers and New Brunswick, I'm thinking of Bleecker Place as it appeared in the 1870s. And the strange thing to me is, as I'm walking through the Voorhees Mall today, it looks like, well, it's always been that way. But, but of course, that's an illusion. It had to be built.
It's a complete illusion, and that was sort of that was as a result of the City Beautiful planning. Now, unlike Minnesota and Columbia, there's nowhere on paper that says we are following the City Beautiful plan. Voorhees Mall is a City Beautiful campus.
It just happened step by step.
It was a step-by-step process with a lot of people involved through the last decade of the 19th century, and all the way into the 1930s and 40s, really.
And a little bit of luck, too.
Yeah, it was a lot of luck. So Bleecker Place, as it was known then, it was named after the Bleecker family of Albany, whom James Nelson, who was not only a trustee and alumni of Rutgers, but on a long line of landowners in New Brunswick. You might have heard of a General Nelson in the Revolutionary War. It's the same family line. He had acquired this land in the late 1800s from, I believe, his father's family, and it was relatively barren, just a huge, imagine the whole block as it is today, but without the buildings, without the grass, without the elm trees.
There's no development.
No development, just a lot of dirt and less than 5 structures, most of which were what we'd see now as tenement houses, sort of these very schlocky looking, put together shotgun shacks. And it was in the it was in the 1870s that Nelson decided he would take this vacant land, which had been property of the Delaware and Raritan Canal decades earlier, and he would establish a ridge in the middle of it running from Hamilton Street up to Seminary Place at the north, and it would be 2 lanes of dirt roads with a ridge in the middle that he planted trees on both ends. So there was 2 rows of trees going up vertically, and that was the start of what could be seen later as the City Beautiful planning. He said, well, you know, there's this whole area of dirt and some middle class to lower income families. Let me make a road in the middle of it to start this process. And then it's when the college steps in, building their first structure there in 1888, New Jersey Hall, which was the agricultural experiment station, this huge Victorian, Richardsonian Romanesque castle of sort, which is still standing today as the Department of Economics at Rutgers. Although the Victorian building, really, that's not City Beautiful, it was the first time Rutgers built anything on the property, and it's when this process started.
It's massive enough that we can almost overlook the fact that it's Richardsonian Romanesque.
Yeah, it's quite large. It's in red brick.
It holds the corner.
Yeah, it holds the corner, and it was that was on a lot that Nelson sold to Rutgers for a few $1,000s on the corner of what was then Bleecker Place West and Hamilton Street. Now, of course, on Voorhees Mall. So that was the first building project there, but that was really before City Beautiful was in mind.
Is the next the Ballentine Gymnasium?
Yeah, it was. The next was essentially on the opposite side of what we now know as the mall. They built Ballentine Gym in sort of a colonial Georgian revival style. It was a monumental building with a lantern in the middle. Brick. It had pilasters and columns throughout it. It was a very celebrated building at the time, and it was because they needed space at this time. This was around, I believe it was completed 1894, 1895. As early as 1891, the students at Rutgers, you know, the late 19th century, this was a time that sort of physical education started being incorporated into college educations, you know, to exercise the minds as well as the body. And as early as 1891, students were calling in the newspapers for them to build a gymnasium. They had only been using a building known as Sudam Hall off of Seminary Place, which had been built in the 1870s as part of the New Brunswick Theological Seminary, known then as the Dutch Reformed Seminary's campus. And the room was much smaller than this one we're sitting in now, and there wasn't much equipment. So Ballentine Gym came as not only to flank, I guess, the other side of the campus of what was then Bleecker Place, but also to accommodate this modern need for athletic facilities. And unfortunately, Ballentine Gym did, although it had an expansion in the 1910s, in sort of the rear on George Street, with the construction of an underground pool and more facilities, it did suffer a massive fire in January 1930 and was reduced to mostly rubble. Part of the structure was saved because in the Great Depression, you could save whatever you could get, and it was restored about a year later. And then in the early 80s, it was built around as the Zimmerle Art Museum we see today. So the structure, as well as the swimming pool, is still there underground and used as storage space. But
it's not recognizable.
It's not recognized as that, no. Very few people know that the building even sort of exists today. But that's just sort of a little factoid that's in there.
Now, the Kirkpatrick Chapel, that was built in 1873, but it's not on the Voorhees Mall.
No.
But it's still part of the story.
Yeah, it's
because it had a library as well.
Yeah, so Henry Janeway Hardenberg, who was the great-grandson, or might be the great-great-grandson of Jacob Hardenberg, who was Rutgers' first president when it was Queens College, he was a young architect and built it in 1873. He would actually go on to build such notable buildings as the Plaza Hotel and the Dakota Apartments in New York City. This was one of his first projects. It was built in the 1870s in sort of a Gothic-ish style with Dutch elements to it. And half the building was the chapel, which was mandatory for students at the time, but the other half, the back portion, was separated by a wall and was the library. But as soon as the 1880s and the 1890s, less than 20 years after the building had been built, they realized this building was way too small. It was built to house about 3,000 volumes, and it had almost 20,000 by the 1890s. And at the around the turn of the century, President Austin Scott at the time recalled that it was in a dire situation and that the floors could collapse potentially because books were stacked on top of one another. It was very dim lit.
Of course, books are heavy.
Books are very heavy, yes. And as more students were coming in, you needed more spaces for study, and you needed more books. You know, there were no e-books at the time. There was no computers, so everything was stored on these shelves and on these floors, and it was a mess, as the photos show. So they needed a new library at the turn of the century.
Now let's jump ahead. The engineering building. That was built in 1908, 1909?
Yes.
Okay. How's it used today?
So today, the former engineering building, which was really the first building to consider the City Beautiful movement after the construction of Voorhees Library some years earlier on Bleecker Place, that was originally the engineering building. It housed the departments of civil, mechanical, and electrical engineering. It was built on funds by Andrew Carnegie, actually, who provided a small yet powerful donation of around $25,000 or so. It's currently used actually as the English department building. It's been renovated many times since it was built at the turn of the century, and almost every Rutgers student, myself included, no matter what major they come from, due to the core curriculum's emphasis on the humanities, almost every student has a class in what's now known as Murray Hall, named after a professor of mathematics.
Even though it still says engineering carved in stone.
Yeah, it's still carved in the terracotta engineering building. It's now the English department, among other things, and relatively, aside from the exterior, there's nothing left of the original interior. There are no more engineering labs in there, of course, because everything eventually moved over to what's now known as Bush Campus across the river.
Now, tell us about the chemistry building. That's what, 1914?
Yeah, the chemistry building came shortly after the engineering building. They were planned roughly around the same time, and it followed the same pattern. They needed spaces, modern spaces, for the study of the sciences, which were really being promoted at that time and had in the City Beautiful vision the progress of humanity was taken into account, and so you have to educate the students. You need proper facilities for that. So the chemistry building was built around that time, and it, similar to the engineering building, it has the words chemistry building with Roman U's, which look like V's, inscribed over the door still today, and that accommodated the chemistry departments for quite a few decades until the 1950s, when it was converted as the chemistry departments moved over to these huge modern mid-century facilities over at Bush campus. But now it's known as Mildler Hall, named after, much like Murray Hall, an old Rutgers professor. I believe in this case it was an old Rutgers president, and was renamed around the 1960s, and the building was converted out. Now it's used for dean's offices, but this was built right next to the engineering building, and it was a way to fill in the north end of this campus, which had started Voorhees Library down by Hamilton Street, then the engineering building, then the chemistry building, now known as Mildler. So it followed this trend that was being set of Rutgers trying to secure the whole land as their own for a mall.
Now, George Hill's house was kind of in the way, wasn't it?
Yeah, George Hill was, I believe he was, ironically, he was an architect in town, and he had a house that was built on the west side of Bleecker Place in the 1880s on a lot sold by, of course, James Nelson, and he used it as his family house. But President Demarest, who was inaugurated 1905-1906, he was a real, he was civic-oriented. He really wanted to build, and he's really the father, I would call him the father of Voorhees Mall, even though he didn't build the first building there. Yeah. He wanted George Hill's house, but because, not to acquire it for the university, because in documents it says he thought it was quite ugly. As you can see in the pictures, it was kind of just very plain, sort of a mishmash like the other few houses at this time on the land, because they didn't have to build to consider the college. The college was all the way across the street in the 1880s. They were just building to build a house for his family. And Demarest approached him shortly after he was inaugurated in the 1900s and wanted to buy his house. He gave him some small number, and Hill said he wouldn't take anything below $35,000. I think Demarest offered him something like
18. Yeah,
I think originally it was 6 or 7, and he said, "Absolutely not. We're not moving." But as time went by, throughout the decade, as all these buildings were popping up, George Hill's wife, in particular, Mrs. Hill, she was very bothered by how much the college had built around them, and was thinking, maybe the president's earlier offer to get us out of Dodge wasn't such a bad idea. So what wound up happening was they wanted this space for building, and in 1919, after a back-and-forth argument of, give me this amount, no, I'll give you that amount, this and that, they settled on, I think it was $18,000 after there was so much arguing.
Back and forth.
Back and forth. I think because the issue went dormant throughout the decade or so, and then they finally did buy his house, and it was moved. It was sold to the College Watchman, I think, for $300, upon which a trustee heard about this and was friendly with the Watchman. He gave him the $300 back because the Watchman had to have it moved to another location. So we're not sure if the building still exists today. Yeah. Back then, houses were lifted left and right because building a house was very expensive. So why lose your whole house and get it demolished when you could just lift it somewhere else?
Sure. Now let's move on to the physics building.
Yes.
This was 1926, I believe.
Yeah, it was the 1920s. So you had built engineering, you had built a library, you had built scientific, agricultural experimentation, and chemistry. Now it was time for the physics department. They had expressed early interest as early as the 1904, 1905 to get their own building. And then finally in the 20s, under President Demarest's successor, John Martin Thomas, they built the physics building roughly not exactly on, but right north of the site of where George Hill's house was. So even though Demarest didn't build on it in 1919, he was probably laying the groundwork for future building, which would come as the money poured in and as students poured in, because physical science was seen as very important at this time. And they named it after the college's oldest professor and sort of their professor emeritus, Professor Van Dyke. And unlike the other buildings, which didn't have names attached to them, this automatically was known as the physics building as well as Van Dyke Hall, which it still is today, known for the history department. Sure. Very different, but the original lecture hall is still there. And sort of like the chemistry building, they wanted to have these stadium seating lecture halls because methods of teaching were changing at the time. It wasn't just 5 people in a room. You were going from numbers in the 10s and 20s of enrollment at the late 1800s, and now you're seeing it in the 4, the 5, the 600s by the 1920s. So they needed that space, and it was the biggest of the 3 science buildings built there, and still stands today at the northwest end of Voorhees Mall.
Tell us a little bit about the statue of William the Silent. It's kind of a focal point.
So William the Silent, the statue there that you see today was, I think, put in 1928. This massive statue on a pedestal of Prince William I of Orange, who was he was known as the founder of the Netherlands in the 1500s, and he was actually the first person to be assassinated by gun. And he was known as a martyr to the Dutch people. And as you might be aware, Rutgers was founded in 1766 by the Dutch Reformed Church, who still has a presence in New Brunswick at the New Brunswick Theological Seminary. So you have the seminary campus on Seminary Place at the time, which it's still there on Seminary Place. And then you have Rutgers over on Hamilton Street. And then Voorhees Mall was sort of the segue between the two, between the old and the new. So putting William of Orange there in a statue form, it's actually modeled after one at The Hague in the Netherlands, was a way to not only add an aesthetic midpoint of this grand statue of this revered man, but also as to create a visual and symbolic connection between the seminary's long-standing history with Rutgers.
And tell us, how did Rutgers go about eliminating automobile traffic in the 1930s?
Yeah, so Bleecker Place was originally a street. It was a 2-lane street going from Hamilton Street to Seminary Place. And originally it was not a problem to have a street there. It was just thought of these buildings were off the street. But as you start to see them thinking of it as a campus, as a mall in the 20s and 30s, they said, you know, this automobile traffic going back and forth is kind of a nuisance. It's creating pollution. It's getting in the way of things. So the Works Progress Administration, which funded all these civic projects after the Great Depression under FDR, they gave about $5,000 to Rutgers to have the roads eliminated in 1936. So the project employed about 50 men, and they went about taking these old macadamized roads that were originally dirt roads and originally just ash and nothing. They took the macadamized roads out and they reseeded them with grass, and then they made these flagstone walks that not only went where the roads used to go, but also crisscrossed on the lawn. That was really when the mall became a mall. It was completely closed in, and not a car has driven through since. So that's how it happened.
And it looks very beautiful. We're lucky to have inherited all this.
Yeah, definitely, and it's worth noting that it was Bleecker Place, and then by the 20s, and especially after James Nelson dies in the 30s, it's really referred to as the Nelson campus. But then in 1974, the Board of Governors decided to go about renaming a bunch of things, and they renamed it. At that point, it wasn't even called the Nelson campus. At that point, it had been called the northern portion of the Queens campus, which is sort of strange because the Queens campus is across the street, so it's a little anachronistic, and they named it after a distinguished alumnus, Tracy S. Voorhees. So that's why it's called Voorhees Mall. It has nothing to do with the library, and it's a little strange because you think Nelson, he had inherited this land, he donated all of it for free, and very few people know about him.
Should have been recognized.
Yeah, so that's why it's called Voorhees Mall today, and that's how it all came about.
Well, Elijah, I want to thank you for coming to East Brunswick Television today.
Yep, thank you for having me.
Thanks for sharing your knowledge.
Yep.